talking recently about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. As you know, some of you guys are in the discussion group. We're studying Cost of Discipleship by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And I thought instead of you guys listening to me so much, we would have someone from the academia world to come and speak. So I want to introduce Dr. Soza here, and it's all yours, sir. So, all right. Yep, right here, thanks. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I've met almost all of you, right? Barb and Sue and the McDonald's, right? And, the other four, I'm sorry. It's Tom and Debbie. Liz and Tim. Ted, nice to see all of you. The two Walts, we can call them first and second Walt, and have new biblical books maybe added to that. And hello to those who might be coming in through Google Meet. Is there a Joel out there? Because that's my first name. So first and second Joel tonight as well. That's special. And anybody else, I just want to say hello to you. Congratulations on your beautiful building. This is really nice. I had a chance to get online just to see if I knew where I was going to be driving to tonight, because I hadn't been on this part of South Arlington Road. I knew that Jackson High School is not too far that way, right? If I come north, I'll probably run into your church. And I said to my wife, it looks like a beautiful area in a nice town called Green. Are you in Green? Are we still Green? Yeah, that's a great name. And I just want to, first of all, thank you, Walt, for inviting me in. So we haven't met until this very moment, and you haven't thrown me out yet, so far so good, and I'm glad to be with you, Walt. I do want to also commend you for the type of thing you are doing. It can be hard in the church. I've served as a pastor in a variety of contexts over my ministerial career, and it's not always easy to get folks to study sometimes more non-traditional things, topics especially that might involve historical topics. I know when I, in the past, have used the word history in the church, I get, oh no, the people don't want to do a historical study of any sort because they somehow associate that with being boring. For me, not at all. It's real human life, and it has everything to do with understanding the story behind us, so that we might understand the present story and fit ourselves into it properly, and perhaps know where the story might be going as well. So, my name is Joel, and as Walt introduced me, I have been serving as a real task, and the reason I was hired there is to be professor of Old Testament. That's where my terminal degree is in. It's in the Old Testament. In most quarters of life, we have to wear many hats, don't we, and do a lot of things. So I serve as the chair of the department right now. We are a department of Bible, theology, and ministry, and our primary task is to train folks for preparation for Christian ministry in a variety of contexts and in a variety of different kinds of jobs. So although I teach Bible primarily, I also teach in some theology. I teach ministry courses as well. My own history, since the Lord called me into ministry many, many years ago, is to have served as a pastor in a number of different churches and a number of different denominations as well. I was also blessed to serve with the U.S. Navy as a chaplain with 3 different units of the U.S. military, including the Navy, the Marines, and the Coast Guard. And when all those wars started happening, my wife said, "You are not going anywhere near that." And I feared her more than I feared my commanding officers. And can I introduce her to you? This is my beautiful wife, Dahlia. And Dahlia and I have been married for, it'll be 33 years now this November. We still laugh. We still have fun. We have crazy date nights. You know how that might be when you're married. You can't do traditional dates anymore. So our dates are like going to Lowe's to buy a new washing machine. But we get excited by it. And what we just did, like little kids, you would have thought we were on a roller coaster. We went through the new car wash up the street here. And look at the colors. Wow. We're just laughing and having fun. And man, we're so easy to please at these points. You don't want to spend any money anymore. You know how that is. But I do want to thank the Lord for my wife, who has been my best friend and companion and sister and ministry partner and the mother of our 2 precious children. One who is 28 years old almost, right? No, I'll be 29 in September. Our daughter lives in the Boston area. She's a senior at Gordon College up there in Boston. So our nest emptied a few years ago. And we don't know if she's ever coming back our way, because you know how that can be. So we're dealing with those realities. But we've actually enjoyed our new life. We've enjoyed the empty nest as well. When I was in graduate school, I spent a year in England studying at the University of Durham, which was a wonderful experience. And my supervisor for my thesis, do you want to guess what his first name was? A hint would be that the name is in this room. That's vault number 3. Yeah, can you? And of course, he was Dr. Moberly to me. He was a great PhD supervisor who was a Cambridge Oxford scholar. So I was way over my head trying to study and learn with him. But he had a wife, and she was doing her master's degree and thesis in Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So if I could have, Walt, when you called me, I said, let me call her. Let's fly her over from England and let her do this, because she would know. She would really know. And I am not a Bonhoeffer scholar. I am an Old Testament professor. But I come with enough confidence, at least to have a platform for lead and discussion, and to also be able to share some things by way of just simple outline, because I'm not sure where you're at on your Bonhoeffer studies. Maybe you've been into this a while. Maybe you know more about it than I do, or maybe you're just entry level with Bonhoeffer. But if I can rewind before we get into Dietrich himself, during my seminarian days where I studied at seminary, I had a church history professor who would walk around the room and he would talk about all these great events and characters of the 2,000 years since the book of Acts, because we all can read that in the Bible, the book of Acts, and then there's like this big hole. What happened after the first century up until recent times? And the church history courses began to build those bridges to the modern era for me, and it was just eye-opening to me, and it included people, whole host of others as well. And he was such an excitable professor that I thought, I want to study this field. But I had a new professor came in who was an Old Testament prof, and he had asked me to be his teaching assistant. And so that led me on the track of, where am I going? Am I doing New Testament? Am I going to do Old Testament? Am I going to do church history? Am I going to do systematic theology? Where will I go with my study? So as much as it's been Old Testament, and that was from the Lord, I'm sure, because my role in the church as preacher as well has required me to spend a lot of time in the biblical text. But I've always loved the story of the church. I've always loved church history. And when I was in seminary, it was still the 20th century. How many of you remember the 20th century? How many of you remember anything before 2020? The world has changed, hasn't it? It's changed a lot in the last few years. But as a seminarian, 1989 to 1994, when I thought about church history, it was everybody way in the past. But now that we're well into the 21st century, 22 years or so into it, it's like, wow, 20th century stories and characters from the church have now taken on new meaning and importance. And if I could, just a real quick kind of overview church history lesson to bring us to Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So if you allow me to do that, when we think about the beginnings of Christianity, we think, of course, of St. Paul and Peter, James, John, and all the rest of the New Testament story who gave us the New Testament. But after that, if you were to survey folks in churches of every different brand and denomination, there might be a lot of blanks. Like, I don't know what happened next. I don't know these characters. But there were some very important persons. What we call after the apostles are the Apostolic Fathers. And these would be folks like Tertullian and Irenaeus, and some special women like Perpetua and others. And then we would move through the time period as the Roman Empire began to take on Christianity. We begin to learn of people like St. Jerome and St. Augustine, and these were the folks who were known as formulators, who began to formulate Christian doctrine in a context of freedom, if you will, because the church had been persecuted in its earliest centuries by the Roman Empire, and that began to change with the so-called conversion of Constantine, the emperor. So I'd love to read about Irenaeus and Tertullian and Justin Martyr and all these folks, and then comes Augustine and others as well. And as we get into the medieval period, we get some great saints. There's folks like St. Catherine and St. John of the Cross, some of these who were known in the mysticism traditions, who were really serious about just separating themselves out to seek God, and gave us some very important writings as well. And as we moved into the late Middle Ages, Thomas Aquinas is especially known for his great theological system called the Summa. And wow, what a story it's been, and it's so rich, and boy, I love it when churches want to talk about these kinds of things. Well, after that, there was the 16th century, and we know things changed radically in the 16th century with Martin Luther posting the 95 Thesis on the door of the Wittenberg Chapel in Germany, and Europe just blew up, didn't it? And we had this movement of break away from the Church of Rome. And then other reformers, John Calvin and Ulrich Zwingli, and then it followed in all these horrible wars amongst Christians. And we know that the legacy is not always a pretty legacy at all. When we think of our story as a Christian family, we have to be honest and say that there were some really bad times and bad things done by certain leaders and popes, and we just need to fess up. We don't always get it right. But the gospel of Christ has been the common thread all through these thousands of years, regardless, that the church continues to proclaim and to herald. So we move beyond the Protestant Reformation, and in the last few hundred years, it's like, I kind of lose a little bit of interest. Now, I shouldn't, because there's a lot of things that are still happening. You've got great awakenings and revivals, and you've got the Wesley brothers and Jonathan Edwards and preachers and teachers and all kinds of things happening during the age of the Enlightenment. And eventually, as we get closer into the 20th century now, and the world changed drastically with the Industrial Revolution and people starting to move into cities and building of factories, and the rise of science, for instance, was something from 1859 with Darwin's Origins of the Species began to just bring a radical shift in thinking, both in the secular world and in the church world. And then we roll into the 20th century when folks thought, hey, certainly the world's going to get better because we have all this learning. And then we ended up with these horrible 2 world wars that many of you can reach back to and were alive during the Second World War. Some of you probably were. And my mother is 90 years old. She was a little girl during the Second World War. And there was a lot of things going on, and a particular German Christian by the name of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So all that kind of sets the table a little bit for what is happening in the early to mid 20th century, particularly in Germany with the rise of Hitler and Nazism. And before I talk about Bonhoeffer, who are some of the other most notable characters of the 20th century, as we can now look back into the previous century and think about who might get headlines in Christian history. This is one of my favorite magazines, and you can see there's a picture of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And Christian History was a magazine that I'm not even sure if it's still happening today, but I would buy all of them back in my seminary days, and I loved them all, and I would just read all of it. And this particular edition is completely devoted to Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So it really gave me a foot into how to study him and to how to kind of condense everything that could be said about Bonhoeffer and all of his writings. And I would recommend get a hold of these Christian history magazines. They are really helpful. Most issues are devoted to one person or character or one event or one particular story in the history of the church. But Mother Teresa, for instance, we can look back at her and think of her contribution, particularly with human suffering and what she did in India. Billy Graham, probably the best known of the evangelists and preachers in the 20th century. And then C.S. Lewis. Yes, sir. Yeah.
Christian history, is there one dedicated to Edith Stein?
I have. The second one was who? I have not seen those. No, I don't know, because I stopped buying these in the 90s. I don't know what's come out since.
Colby was a priest in 41. 10 prisoners escaped, so Fitch decided to kill. One prisoner escaped, he decided to kill 10 prisoners. So he picked
she had a PhD in phenomenology. She was an atheist, and she became a Christian. And they came for the Jews in 44 when the priests in Holland spoke up against Hitler. So anybody that was a Jew that became a Christian, they took them. They took Edith Stein and her sister Rosa.
So
It's
some
an
other,
interesting character.
yeah, 20th century folks
Have heroic virtue.
during that same period, where Corrie ten Boom is another one, is well known for hiding Jews during that period in Holland. In fact, I'm going to have my wife give you a handout, and just keep this. It's going to be a simple handout that you can follow along with me for our discussion. I think what I'll do is I'll walk through this handout and then just open it up for your conversation, comments, questions. And we can kind of just do this together. Yes, Mr. McDonald?
Well, that's being passed out. I taught music history.
Wonderful.
And I noticed that there was a tendency for there to be kind of a sine wave in activity. Some of them were short, some of them were longer periods, depending largely on communication. But I think we've got the 20th century went through at least 2 periods, if not possibly 3, in the artistic world, which generally reflects a reaction, kind of like a mirror, but also like a challenge. You don't like what you see, change society, don't try to change the arts. The arts are a reflection of that. But I wondered if you noticed that sort of thing too, so that one period's joy is another period's anguish.
So that's something. Yeah, well, I'd have to ask my daughter. She studies art, and she's an artist. I'm going to ask her that question. She would probably have a good answer for you.
Yeah.
I am lacking in that good art history course, so when you teach that, invite me in. I need to learn that. No, but that would be an interesting pursuit.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
That's fine. No, it was actually perfect. You know the right moments. You're a teacher. You know these are the right moments. So you have an outline, and this is me just trying to put something together for us to follow. And let me walk through the outline, and at the very bottom of the outline, you'll notice I put a place for reflections and notes. So if you want to write anything down, or if you have questions you want to ask or comments you want to make, put them in there, and then we'll come back to this. So the life and times of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, why don't we start with that? Again, I'm going to assume that you have no knowledge of Bonhoeffer, although you probably do, but let's just use that as our starting point. You can see in the title, he was born in 1906 and he died in 1945, so doesn't even make it to his 40th year. He's a young man when he dies. And to the outline, he lived, he worked, and he did ministry in Germany during the Nazi era. Now, if you think about that right now, about your context of life, when were you born, what year were you born, where were you born, immediately it's going to say a lot about your life, right? Like for myself, I am a child of the 60s and raised in the 70s. So one of the things I saw in my life, I remember I was in the military, I was in the service during the Iran hostage crisis and thought I was going to get deployed over there. I remember that. Of course, 9/11, we've lived through that. We've had the COVID crisis. But many of you can reach back further, into the 60s and the 50s or the 40s and think about where you were born, what is the context of life? Well, if knowing what you know about the world and you were starting over and you just kind of drew a ticket and it said, Sue, I'll just say your name since I remember your name. Sue, you get to be born in Germany in 1906. What would you say about that, knowing what you know about the world now? No, thank you. You know what's coming. Yeah. You know that as a young person, there would be the First World War. You know that the Second World War would be when you were really somewhat of even military age. And this is what Dietrich Bonhoeffer was born into. During his life, he supported, and he also was in support of an assassination attempt on Adolf Hitler. So this is where much of the talking point comes. Because, is this morally right or not? Now, we all maybe have different positions on the issue of pacifism or not, just war theory. These are big debates in the church, And even where I teach at Malone is rooted in the Quaker Evangelical Friends tradition, which is a peace tradition church. I serve a Brethren church now, which is a peace tradition church, although I've got 10 years of military experience in my background, both as chaplain and as enlisted person. It's kind of an interesting animal, and you know, how do I feel about Bonhoeffer being in support of trying to kill Adolf Hitler? How do you feel about this? We can come back to that question, but it's a leading conversation piece around the life of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He started what we'll call really an underground church. The Confessing Church is what it was called. And it was called the Confessing Church because these were those who would not take an oath to Hitler. Because Hitler was trying to do a power play to get all of the German ministers to support his Reich and to support his efforts at Arianism and what he was trying to do, and of course destroying the Jews and raising up the so-called master race. So there were many German pastors who signed off and supported him, and there were those who did not. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a leading voice against showing any allegiance to the state church of Hitler. Hitler took a famous photograph coming out of one of the German churches and had it disseminated out to all of the German pastors to show, look at me, I'm a churchman. And Bonhoeffer would not bite on that, and Bonhoeffer began to openly speak against Hitler and what he was doing. And this would eventually lead to him losing his post as a university professor, and eventually what would cause him to be put into prison. He also started a seminary that was an underground seminary, so it was not part of the traditional, say, German Lutheran seminaries. He had to do this with little funding, but there were a lot of students who wanted to study with Bonhoeffer, who were opposed to what Hitler was doing, and who felt a call to Christian ministry that did not embrace what the Third Reich was doing in Germany during the rise of Hitler, particularly in the 1930s and on into the 1940s. And eventually, he was hung by order of Adolf Hitler himself. April the 8th, the date might actually be April the 9th. I think I've run into two different dates. But if you look at that date, in 1945, you can see how close he was to the end of the war. Hitler would be dead in a few weeks. So it's really tragic and unfortunate that they executed him just prior to Hitler's own suicide, or however he died, and all that goes with that, and then the liberation of the death camps and the defeat of the Third Reich. So he just missed it by a few weeks. And in fact, when he was put to death, like the same day, he had brothers-in-laws who were being put to death by the Nazis, and dear friends who were being put to death. I mean, it was a whole slew of close people to him. It was a terrible tragedy for that circle of friends and family, because it wasn't just Bonhoeffer, it was these others as well. His sisters, husbands were being killed. But they were all together, as a family in their mission to not let Hitler get away with what he was doing. His father's name was Karl, psychiatrist and neurologist in Berlin. So Dietrich Bonhoeffer is generally thought to have been born into a certain amount of privilege. He had 7 siblings. It was a large family of 8. He was in the middle of that. He had a twin sister, and she was the last one to survive. She was, by 1993, she was like 86 years of age, so I'm sure she's passed since then. And she was like her now dead brother, Dietrich. And so he was a twin. You would appreciate this, my brother McDonald. He's a piano player. He was a musician. This is really kind of a startling little, fun fact on Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He chose to be a theologian. And by theologian, I mean scholar, theologian, by age 14. Who does that anymore? Ask a 14-year-old out there, what is a theologian? And they'll probably, I don't know what that is. But he was raised in the early 20th century when theology had been considered, certainly going back to the Elizabethan era, as the queen of the science. To study theology was considered top of the heap of prestige. Of course, that has changed a lot in recent centuries. But Bonhoeffer wanted to be a theologian by 14 years of age. His dad didn't like the idea. The other brothers were going into more prestigious professions that had good pay. And his dad was like, well, I don't like it, but he wasn't going to resist his son. And Bonhoeffer earned his doctorate in theology by age 21. That's my daughter right now. And she's doing really good. She's a good student, but she's not quite there yet to be a doctor. So that's kind of a brief nutshell of his life, who he was. His influences, as we all have influences, think about what has influenced you in your life. And I've revolved this around two areas: travel, where he went, and then the people that were around him. So he traveled a bit to Rome, North Africa, Cuba, so he made it to the Western Hemisphere, Mexico as well. He spent some time in England. He pastored in Barcelona, Spain. He studied at Union Seminary here in the United States, which was very formative for him. And while he was there, he was doing some ministry, working with churches in Harlem, New York. And this is where he came upon the plight of the black in America and began to see the world in a different way, from the privilege he knew in Germany to recognizing people who were in places in life that were challenged, difficult, perhaps even injustice. He also spent some time in Germany working with poor kids and orphaned kids around Berlin. In Barcelona, Spain, he spent some time also working with poor people. This began to change him, and I'm saying this to my congregation all the time, because my congregation tends to be, rural, and they only know that world, and I'm always trying to expose them to recognize what it is to be in someone else's shoes in this world, so that you develop a greater sense of awareness and compassion and just understanding of the world around you, and why is the world changing the way that it is changing as well. He sees in other countries outside of Germany, so he had gone to Norway, Sweden, Switzerland. So he got around a bit, and it was the Greek philosophers who had said something to the effect of, the one who travels develops much sagacity, meaning there's wisdom in leaving your comfort zone and getting out there and traveling. And so Bonhoeffer, that's what gave him a lot of wisdom. He was a well-trained academician studying at Tübingen University in Germany, but it was his exposure to other peoples that really began to transform his heart as well. And then the people who were influential in his life, a lot of these German names, I don't want to pronounce them, but I will note a few of the names that are listed here, like Karl Bart, for instance. Bart was a Swiss theologian who was older than Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and Bart was very formative for him as well. And Bart called him, just a miracle of theology, this brilliant young man. And Bart was known as a biblicist, so he was one who was, in that day, in the early mid-20th century, he was calling people back to what he called the strange new world of the Bible, and to saying, let's not just look at the Bible scientifically in this age of science, but let's get back to its strange world of what's it trying to say. What's it trying to say about God? What's it trying to say about the nature of human beings? And so he was influenced by this very, very important theologian named Karl Bart. Reinhold Niebuhr also was a theologian who was sort of the preacher theologian who was concerned about not just learning what texts meant in history, but what do texts mean today? How do they transform people? How do they transform our world? Gandhi, we know who Gandhi was, and so a lot of Westerners are influenced by Gandhi just because of his peaceful resistance movement against, of course, in his day, the British Crown. And so this also moved him to learn from Gandhi and his methods of trying to bring change to society. Another name that I didn't put down there, you can tell this is a German name, Adolf von Harnack, was a German church historian. And so Bonhoeffer began to become very inspired by church history from Adolf von Harnack. So we think of the name Adolf. Now, I don't know about you, but I made a mistake once giving a lecture at the university to my students years ago. And I was talking about Jezebel from the Old Testament, right? And I was saying, now nobody names their daughters Jezebel. I mean, nobody's known a Jezebel, right? Maybe it's a cat's name or a dog's name or something. But we don't do that because of what a bad character she is in the Bible. And then I made the mistake of saying, like, I never meet anyone named Adolf, which, of course, I'm in America. I'm not in Germany. And then I did this for years. Then one day a young lady stood up and said, my father's name is Adolf. And I just went, and I scratched. I can't never say that again. That was a mistake on my part. But so there was the Adolf Hitler in Bonhoeffer's life, and there was the Adolf von Harnack in Bonhoeffer's life. Adolf von Harnack was a positive influence. The Adolf Hitler was the one that he was trying to resist and to preach the message of Christ and love for all peoples of the world. So the writings and teachings, if I can move to that, just trying to do a bit of a bio on Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Who am I? I think I'm going to come back and read that. How many of you have been reading Cost of Discipleship? Some of you have been, maybe, maybe not. If you have the Cost of Discipleship, I got an old University Malone Library copy of it. My wife had got one that's just a little nicer looking in its packaging. Not particularly easy reading, but the friend of Bonhoeffer who writes a foreword, an English minister by the last name of Bell, talked about how wonderful Bonhoeffer was. And he quotes this poem from Bonhoeffer, which is a poem while he was in prison called Who Am I? So I'm going to come back to that and read it to you in just a moment. Here's some of the other ones: the Communion of Saints, Act and Being, Creation and Fall, Christ the Center. I mean, did a lot of writing for a young man. His best well-known work is The Cost of Discipleship. So, well, right, you picked the right book, right? It's kind of it's a classic now, isn't it? And he wrote this fairly early on in his life, which in German, it's one word, and it's written down in here somewhere, but it's one word that basically means following. So the cost of discipleship is a call to follow. And it's Bonhoeffer's call for folks to follow Christ in particular. And it is a classic now. It's has a lot of elements to it. Much of it is a development of the Sermon on the Mount, which is an important choice, because when you think of the ministry of Jesus, and we read in Matthew's gospel that Jesus comes on the scene and he's preaching repentance, for the kingdom of God is at hand. But his first major substantial teaching is the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, 6, 7, and so forth, where Jesus really lays it out as sort of a new Moses. Because remember, Moses on the Mount of Sinai, Jesus sort of being the new Moses on the Mount, giving this new message of, blessed are you if, and then he goes on to the Beatitudes and all these other things that he says. So much of Cost of Discipleship is simply Dietrich Bonhoeffer unpacking Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And it inspired me to preach my sermon this Sunday on the Sermon on the Mount. So, and I'm going to do what I'm doing today for our Sunday school class at church to introduce our people to Bonhoeffer. Oh, you know what else I'm going to do? Is I have a bunch of these magazines. I'm going to bring them in. I'm going to lay them out. And I'm going to say, folks, pick one. And I'll give you a 20-minute window, during Sunday school. And my wife, you're the first. You're going to do one in August. And what's the topic you're looking at doing? Martyrs in the early church, right? In the early centuries, particularly people like Polycarp and Perpetua, so we get a male and a female and what they endured. And what I'm trying to do is inspire the folks to say, hey, I can get in and study. I can become a miniature expert on a person and take that and bring it to our folks. So that's what we're going to try to do. So I'll be doing Bonhoeffer in Sunday school this Sunday, and then I'll be preaching the Sermon on the Mount a la Dietrich Bonhoeffer as well in the sermon that follows. The Cost of Discipleship, just a few things. It's a big, lengthy, not an easy read kind of a book, but there are a few terms that Bonhoeffer uses, of course, translated from the German into English, that have become sort of mantras about the book. One being cheap grace. He starts off with this, cheap grace. And what Bonhoeffer means by cheap grace is just really anybody who hears the call to follow Christ. He says, yeah, I'll sign off on that, but I'm not changing my life. I'm going to live any way I want to. So that the grace of God becomes cheap. And I mean, this is St. Paul in Romans 6. Shall we continue in sin that grace might abound? May it never be, Paul would say. Don't take the grace of God, the free gift of eternal life through the death and resurrection of Christ. Not responding to it as Christ calls us to follow, again, the title of this book, Cost of Discipleship. Religionless Christianity is kind of a similar theme here. Or by religionless, he simply means people who don't practice Christianity. They profess it, they confess it, but they don't live it out. And in his day, the ante was raised. You could lose your life. And we've seen this in the history of the church. The earliest Christians had to make a decision. Am I going to be baptized publicly? They might kill me. I got the Roman Empire out here. They don't want us having these alternate religions out here following this Jesus, this new way. So it could cost one their life. In my experience, no one's ever put a gun to my head saying, don't confess Christ, or what's the opposite? What's the word I'm looking for? Renounce Christ. No one's ever done that to me. I mean, the worst persecution I have is, maybe being in a debate with someone who's putting me down because I believe in Jesus. But for Bonhoeffer, it became real. It became real life and death. And that's what makes his life so important to us today. And then the idea of come die, which is also written in your outline here. This is what Bonhoeffer said. When Christ calls a man, and by that he means, the inclusive, a person, a human. When Christ calls a human, he bids that person to come die. Well, who wants to do that? But that's the teaching of Jesus, right? He who keeps his life will lose it, but he who loses his life for my sake in the gospel shall find it. For Bonhoeffer, though, when he emphasized this theme of when Christ calls you to follow, he's calling you to come and die, for him it would be literal. And I'm sure he didn't know that, but I'm sure that became more evident that it could be very literal for him. And it was. Quite honestly, at my stage of life, I hope to have a few more good decades of living. I really do. But I can look back over my life and feel like, I've been able to really have a good, full life already and serve the Lord. And if the Lord calls me home, I can deal with that. But at age 39, there's too much to do. I want to see my kids grow, and so on and so forth. So come and die is the cost of discipleship. And then you can see some of his other writings, not all of which are books. Some are poems and letters from prison, for instance. What was fascinating, he was one of these prisoners in the German camps that he won over the prison guards because of his mild manner, his gentleness, his kindness, his love. When the Allies were doing bombing raids and the bombs were falling near the prison, everyone else feared for their life, and he just was calm, and everyone wanted to get near him. They could sense his calm, and he would share, his faith in Christ and in God, and he actually won some prison guards over that they helped smuggle out these letters and to preserve them for him. And I thought that I would read the Who Am I, and then we'll turn it over to you for your comments or thoughts or reflections. But this is one of his writings. This is a poem written from a Berlin prison cell as Dietrich Bonhoeffer is getting nearer to the end of his life. And as you listen to this, about 6 or 7 paragraphs, it's not too long, just take notes. What's he saying? What's he doing here? What do you think of this? And what's going on in the mind and heart and psyche of Dietrich Bonhoeffer while he's in prison? Here we go. Who am I? Who am I? They often tell me I would step from my cell's confinement calmly, cheerfully, firmly, like a squire from his country house. Who am I? They often tell me. I would talk to my warders freely and friendly and clearly, as though it were mine to command. Who am I? They also tell me I would bear the days of misfortune equably, smilingly, proudly, like one accustomed to win. Am I then really all that which other men tell of? Or am I only what I know of myself? Restless and longing and sick, like a bird in a cage, struggling for breath, as though hands were compressing my throat, yearning for colors, for flowers, for the voices of birds, thirsting for words of kindness, for neighborliness, trembling with anger at despotisms and petty humiliation, tossing in expectation of great events, powerlessly trembling for friends at an infinite distance, weary and empty at praying, at thinking, at making, faint, and ready to say farewell to it all. Who am I, this or the other? Am I one person today and tomorrow another? Am I both at once? A hypocrite before others and before myself, a contemptibly woebegone weakling, or is something within me still like a beaten army fleeing in disorder from victory already achieved? Who am I? They mock me, these lonely questions of mine. Whoever I am, thou knowest, O God, I am thine. Thoughts, reflections on the poem? Please share if you have any. What do you think? Yes, Bart.
I was reading, it's about this thick, a book on the life of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I've only gotten about a third of the way through. When I became ill and my family moved me to a new apartment, and I haven't found it, so it's probably at my other niece's house. But anyhow, the thing that came home to me was he was in England first, and he kept saying, I have to go back to Germany and support my people. And his friend said, oh no, stay here. You'll be safe here. And then he came to America, and his friends here said, stay here for the duration of the war, you'll be safe here. And he would not stay where he was safe.
Right.
He had to go back and support the people of Germany that fought like he did.
He did. Yeah, right. He had just come to the United States, and his heart was just being really convicted that he needed to be back with his people.
Mm-hmm.
So you're right, Barb. He left the security to go back home, and he wanted to serve particularly the oppressed people of Germany and become a pastor to them. And so Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the pastor, one of the things I appreciate him is this great theologian, but also the pastor. One of the passages that left a mark on him from the Bible was from Jeremiah chapter 45. It's a very short little chapter that also has left a mark on me, because in that particular chapter of the book of Jeremiah, the whole book in which Jeremiah's life is like, it's a bad time to live. It's kind of like living in Nazi Germany. For Jeremiah, it was during the rise of the Babylonian Empire. And I mean, he would never marry. He would never have all the things of life. You're going to be this prophet. It's going to be like fire shut up in your bones. But Jeremiah had a young companion. And Baruch was from a family that had some notoriety. And Baruch was looking at an aspiring career as a young man. So back to Jeremiah 45. What the Lord says through the prophet Jeremiah to his young friend Baruch is, are you still seeking great things for yourself? And God basically says, if you get out of this thing with your life, you should be happy. So precisely what spoke to Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a passage like that said, I can't stay in America or in England, seek great things for myself. He could have had a great career. He had to come home and be with his people, and it cost him his life. So it's a great tragedy, but then look how much he has taught us because of that decision, and that we're even talking about him tonight. We probably wouldn't have, right, had he stayed in the United States and had a career as an academician. So the great point, I'm glad you brought that up, that he could have stayed in the West, and he didn't. Very good point. Other thoughts on the poem, Who Am I? Or just any questions, comments, or reflections you have on the life and times and ministry of Dietrich Bonhoeffer? Dahlia? Oh. Well, we'll go over to you next, Derek.
Go ahead.
Sure. So the poem, to me, seems like he's writing about the struggle that he was going through within himself, which I think is beautiful. The phrase that says, am I really then that which other men tell of? Or am I only what I myself know of myself, restless, longing, sick, struggling for breath? To me, it almost seems like he's describing having anxiety being depressed, feeling like I've got, all those feelings, and yet he didn't. The way other people portray him is that he was calm. He didn't have fear, but he did. In this poem, he's describing that he did have all those things, which I think we're hard on ourselves. We judge ourselves like, oh, I'm a terrible person but it's human to have those feelings. He just didn't act upon them. He still trusted in his God, and I just think it's beautiful what he's describing in the poem.
Others saw him as this rock in the prison, but he didn't always see himself that way. So at the end, the way he resolves it is, I am thine, O Lord. I guess I'm who you say I am. And that's for us to resolve ourselves that way as well, right? This kind of imposter syndrome thing that we think, I'm not really worthy of what people think I am I? But, yes,
I had a
Bart.
question about his involvement with the attempt to assassinate Hitler,
Yeah.
and his Christian following of Christ, who said, he who takes the sword will die by the sword. I don't know what the sequence is there. I would imagine that he moved from the one into the other, that is, from the assassination plot to the other, but I don't know. How do you reconcile that involvement?
Yeah, I'll make a comment or two, and then I'll let you speak. And that is, like, the magazine itself just sort of doesn't get into it completely. And it left me a little bit wondering, how involved was he really? I mean, he was supportive, but to the point of taking action or not. Now, there's a number of movies that have come out on Dietrich Bonhoeffer that you can go find, and it shows you different accounts of that where he may be a little bit more involved in the conspiracy. For me, I have to just say, I don't really know where he was involved in that, and I don't know what I would have done in any situation. That plane flying over Shanksville, would I have attacked those hijackers? I probably would have. That's different than maybe other acts of, when and where is violence appropriate? That's a big question. But yes, my friend, please go ahead.
You talked about, what John was talking about, we talked about Bible study. If you go back to God the Father, he killed Sodom and Gomorrah, he wiped them out. If you look at Noah, there was only 8 people that lived, he wiped out the rest of the earth. If you look at that couple, the one lady said she lied and said she gave all the money to the inheritance and she got struck dead, and then her husband got struck dead for doing the same thing.
Yeah.
That's God doing what you're trying to say,
Right.
standing up against evil and trying to destroy it. So, it's Jesus said that, God the Father actually. There's cases in the Bible where he did it.
Yeah, you can see there's violence that crosses, even in the New Testament. You mentioned the Ananias Sapphira story in Acts 5. The question of what is a person's responsibility becomes a really complex question. Now, the way Christianity has framed the issue is around 2 poles, right? There's a just war theory that St. Augustine developed, that there's time for warfare and killing, and then there is pacifism, which is absolute, complete non-resistance at all times. For me, I don't like any of those poles, those extremes. What I've always said when I've been asked, especially where I teach, which has a tradition of pacifism, and I have a military background, what I say is, the way I live my life is discern and take action. That's my life. In other words, in a given moment, I will act according to how I think the Holy Spirit is leading me to act in that moment. So, there was a moment when someone attacked my brother, so I got in the fray. I was a young guy, but I felt I needed to do that in that moment. In a general sense, I'm a pacifistic person, wouldn't you say, dear? It's gentle and kind, and I think, so that's how I kind of reconcile it. If I was in Bonhoeffer's position, what would I have done? I just don't know. I do not condemn him, and I don't condone per se either. I just kind of sit back and wonder and question and think, how do I live my daily life, and how would I handle the situation? Barb? Yeah.
In the 90s, Christophe von Docknonier was the conductor of the Cleveland Orchestra. And at that time, one of the churches in I think it was Shaker Heights, anyhow, they had a program, and he came and answered questions about his uncle. And of course, Hans von Danier was his father. And he talked about the things that, he talked about Bonhoeffer being very human in that he had bald spot. And he was very, very annoyed when the kids tormented him about his bald spot. But anyhow, he talked about life at that time. He said, my parents would put us to bed at night. And then he said, but we weren't asleep, and we heard the noises. They were bringing people up. They apparently lived on a river. And they were bringing people up and passing them on to safe stations. And, but he said he was, just a kid in school, and they listened to the BBC on the radio at night. And he told one of his friends about it. Wow. He said, I learned very quickly not to mention it to anybody because he was turned in for listening to the BBC. And the kids were all home one day when the SS came and hauled Mama and Daddy off. And he said, my mother turned to us and said, call your grandmother, call your grandmother. So we can't imagine what that man went through. It's just a different, something we can't imagine.
Yes, please.
Did he write the Cost of Discipleship before he became part of the assassination group? Because it's almost like maybe he evolved beyond, because in here he says the only way to overcome evil is to let it run itself to a standstill, because it does not find the resistance it's looking for. That resistance merely creates further evil and adds fuel to the flames. And then the very end it says, then evil, by not revenging it, then evil cannot find its mark, it cannot breed no further evil, and is left barren. And that maybe Hitler became so evil that it was evil beyond what anybody could imagine. And then he evolved to be part of the resistance, maybe, or the assassination part of it.
I think you're probably right on that, because my understanding is he finished the Cost of Discipleship prior to the start of the war even. So once the war started, and things got worse, and then the roundup of the Jews and everything, so you're probably right with that.
How long was he in prison?
It was just, I think, for months. I don't think that he made it much more than a year in prison.
He's pretty busy writing when he was there.
Yeah. He was a scholar and a theologian, so he's going to put himself to work, isn't he? Yeah. Okay, are there any other final thoughts or questions? Yes,
Yeah.
please.
If Dietrich Bonhoeffer were alive today,
Yeah.
with the many things that are happening within the United States, what do you think his advice would be to the churches and how they should respond?
So great question. I mean, really modern day America. So what Bonhoeffer taught and preached is the Reich was idolatry. Hitlerism, the Fuhrer, was idolatry. So how would we plug and play, into the 21st century? I think that we as Americans have a similar issue with mixing God and country, and somehow seeing ourselves as somehow superior or elite to the other nations of the world, and that it becomes idolatry, the way we look to political leaders, and it becomes similar, and it can lead down a similar path where that will go. And Hitler showed us to the extreme of where it can go. So I think as Americans, we need to be aware of when we allow people in power to wave a flag to such a degree, it could go down a really ugly path. And I think he would say that to us, that we have got to know how to separate out our loyalty to our country with our loyalty to the kingdom of Christ, which is different. And that's what he was trying to do, call the German pastors to recognize we're not German Christians per se, we're Christians. And we've got to preach the kingdom of Christ, which is something way beyond any earthly kingdom. And then this is the Bible over it. The whole book of Daniel is this, right? Statue comes collapsing. Babylon, Rome, throw them the countries of the world, all the empires. I mean, whether it's the English Empire or the American Empire, it all comes crashing down at the foot of the cross of Christ. So I think that's what he would say, and I think that's what we need to learn. And I hope that a study like this would be the kind of thing that would transform our American churches to see our loyalty to Christ, his kingdom, and to the world, and that every human being matters in this world. We're not superior because we're Westerners or white or anything. And Bonhoeffer got it, and he got it because he traveled, and he read well, and he began to learn. And as you said, he evolved. We all need to do that. We all need to be evolving all the time. I mean, you even see it when you read Paul's writings from Galatians early on, where he's like, I wish you'd all castrate yourselves too. Where he becomes a much more temperate apostle later in life because of his experience in prison. All right, very good question. Okay. Walt?
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Excellent.
You're very welcome. Yeah.
Next series is going to be a speaker to talk about mental health and where are we going, where the church is going after. And then we're going to be doing a parenting class on a weekend. So, but those are to still be scheduled. So, but thank you very much. Thanks for everyone. Yes.
You don't have a date yet for the next one?
Not yet.
Oh, okay.
I'm scheduling the mental health psychiatrist to come in and talk to us about where the church is after COVID and what we're doing next and the issues that his therapists are seeing in the home, the family, the church. So we're putting that together. This should be, I'm thinking, in July.
Okay.
So, yeah. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you for making the trip from Louisville to
It's
us tonight.
nice for me to see this part of the country.
You go to Stow every Sunday, right?
I used to, well, my church, I now serve in North Georgetown.
Oh, okay.
That's kind of old news. I was in Stow.